What happened to Hummel? They went from being a pioneer in the football boots and shirt world to them being irrelevant, but now they've made a comeback and have become one of the fan favourites within football. So let's take a look at the rise, the fall, and the rise again of Hummel. Where did it all start? Well, in Germany, funnily enough, the notorious Danish associated brand. In 1923, the business was founded in Hamburg by entrepreneurs Max Albrecht and Ludwig Mesmer. It was known as Mesmer & Co. at the beginning, but the company would later be known as Hummel after they brought out a football shoe onto the market with the same name. It was in the 60s where Hummel was taken over by Bernard Beckenbrock. Under his watch, the Hummel brand was modernised to compete in the growing market. They created the two arrow design for the football boot, but maybe the most notable step by Hummel in their early days, it was when they brought out the first pair of white football boots. Before this, football boots were mainly brown or black, but in the 1970 Community Shield final, the famous Everton midfielder Alan Ball, who was reportedly paid about £2,000 a year by Hummel at the time, he wore white boots in that game. The commentator and cameraman regularly focused on Alan Ball during this game, with the former calling him Twinkle Toes. During this time, Hummel was selling around 2,000 pairs of football boots a year. After this game, they sold 12,000 just within the next month. It was a huge marketing success, but I think it was a great step for football innovation, because like I say, there was no creativity prior to this. It probably paved the way for all the football boots that we see today. But in terms of football shirts, it was a slower start to Hummel in this market. They had Rot-Weiss Essen in the German league, and they were the first team that I could find who wore Hummel shirts. During the 70s, Hummel worked with multiple different teams, predominantly in Germany, mainly Werder Bremen, but their historic deal would not happen until 1980, where Hummel would bring out their first of many Danish national team shirts. I think most of us do see Hummel as a very Danish-owned brand because, you know, the partnership with the national team over the years. In the early 80s, that actually did become Danish-owned, when Jørgen Vosgaard, Max Nielsen, and footballers Frank Arnesen, Allan Simonsen, and Henning Jensen also became owners of the company. When Hummel started to create shirts for Denmark, it kind of coincided with, you could argue, their golden generation. In the 80s, notable names were the Laudrup brothers, Michael and Brian. You had the tail end of Allan Simonsen, Peter Schmeichel, Jan Molby. As I say, a great shirt is a great shirt regardless. However, when it's worn by a ridiculously talented team, and an iconic team at that, it's a partnership that just becomes iconic and timeless. Despite having some brilliant designs in the early 80s, the historic kit was featured in the 1986 World Cup. You could say a revolutionary kit, in a time where football shirts, they had become more creative, but they hadn't seen the artistic boom of the 90s yet. It was one of a kind, with a half and half design, matched with Hummel's famous arrows. It's seen as one of the best designs ever created. Even nearly 40 years after the initial release, Denmark re-released the shirt in 2023. But if we're going to the late 80s, this is where Hummel started to flourish. An 8-year relationship began with Spanish giants Real Madrid, seeing the club win 4 straight La Liga titles in some of the team's most creative designs to date. Hummel also acquired Aston Villa in 1987, where they would reuse the 1986 World Cup design on the club. Spurs wore Hummel kits from 1985 to 1991, whilst Wimbledon's Crazy Gang also wore Hummel shirts during the late 80s. However, in 1992, Hummel saw a massive stroke of luck, you could say. With international football, they hadn't really stamped the name. They had Denmark, of course, they had briefly worked with Wales, and they had Norway, who wore their B logo for most of the 80s. But after not qualifying for the 1992 Euros, Denmark were placed in the tournament due to Yugoslavia dropping out at the last minute. They would go on to create one of the biggest upsets in international football history by beating West Germany in the final. They again would wear an iconic design, especially with Peter Schmeichel wearing one of the most colourful jerseys people had seen at the time, which subsequently inspired Bristol City's keeper kit nearly 30 years later. Maybe I put too much importance on this, but once a team wins a major final in a particular kit, I do think it is immortalised. I do think it becomes an icon of future years. You'll see it on TV replays, you'll see it on posters, you'll see it on articles. But going into the 90s, there was a big fall. Real Madrid moved to the Spanish company Kelmer. Hummel's only constant was Denmark. They had some brief years with Copenhagen, Udinese, Benfica, but aside from that, they were not a major player in the market. Reportedly, Hummel nearly went bankrupt in the early 90s, with sources saying they tried to expand too quick. Going into the 2000s, Hummel's strategy had changed. They were focusing on retro kit releases. However, disaster struck in 2004, where Adidas would become the new kit makers for the Danish national team. As a story that keeps on coming up on this channel, Nike and Adidas took over in the 2000s. Most top European teams were getting their kits made from one of the two, and due to Denmark's success in previous tournaments, they were highly touted by Adidas. I just want to stop the video here and say thank you so much for the support over the last 2 years, the last few months. And I'd like to say, if you are enjoying the content, subscribe to the channel, it really helps me out. Leave a like, leave a comment, tell me what you think, build a little community. I'm hoping to get to maybe 5-10k subs by the end of the year. But like I say, really appreciate the support. I'll get back to the video. But this to me was a symbol with the company. They had lost their pride and joy. There are certain kit suppliers that are just synonymous with certain football teams. As I said in my previous video, Juve and Kappa. Umbro, a lot of people can see them with the English team or the Man United teams. And you can't picture a Denmark shirt without a Hummel name on it. Going into the 2004-05 season, the main team Hummel had on the roster was Aston Villa. International wise, they seemed to just go for lesser known nations, that it seemed basically they were there just to keep the lights on. However, their notoriety across the footballing world had just completely fallen off. During the 2000s as well, Hummel also shifted their attention to the popular Scandinavian sport, handball, and it seemed like the passion for football had just seemed to dwindle out. However, going into the 2010s, focus on retro kits increased. If anything, the lack of top teams declined even further throughout the early 2010s. They signed with the iconic German club St. Pauli briefly in 2014. However, going into 2016, there was life added back into the company. Despite initially changing from Hummel to Adidas for financial reasons, the DBU, the Danish FA, they decided they wanted to reignite the partnership with Hummel. They said they wanted a more authentic Danish partnership, and during this decade Hummel had built up quite a strong ethical identity. As said, partnering with St. Pauli and also Bohemians in Ireland, again who are renowned for their deep club values, which led the DBU to make Hummel their kit supplier once again. Other than the Danish national team, Hummel were able to sign more well-known teams again. Did they ever reach the heights of a Real Madrid? No. But teams like Middlesbrough, Rangers, they were all wearing that logo to close out the decade. If we're being honest, the 2020s have been the most successful decade for Hummel since, you could say, the 80s. From 2020 to 2024, Everton wore their kits, notably being worn during their iconic Kazoo title race. Southampton were in Hummel kits from 2021 to 2024, but to me, they've capitalised on the retro shirt boom during this decade. Modern shirts, they just became boring, too predictable. They had no creativity. But whilst Hummel were able to flog off some of their older shirts, they were able to revitalise their 1986 design for new modern shirts. The Werder Bremen shirt in 2023 is a standout for me. That is a classic. They were able to sign Real Betis back in 2022 for the first time in over 30 years. And like I say, they've been able to make a modern take on the Real Betis shirts from the 80s. Even Sunderland this year, they have a brilliant home and away kit, with the latter paying respects to the shirts of the late 80s. I mean, a quick shout out to the Greenland kit as well. It's just an unreal design. But we'll finish on the Denmark kit Hummel made for the Qatar World Cup. To be in protest of the human rights issues plaguing the event, Hummel wanted a faded out shirt to have little association with the tournament, with slogans saying part of something bigger printed inside the kit. To me, they were just another casualty of Adidas and Nike and kind of Puma's expansion throughout football. And there's so many of them that we'll cover in future videos, but it's nice to see Hummel bringing out creative kits and still having some relevance in the footballing world. But that is why Hummel had a huge rise, a quick fall, and then a rise again. And that 1986 design will live on forever. But let me know what you think. Let me know what you think as Hummel as a brand. Do you like the kits? Do you not like them? Are you a big fan of the 1986 shirt? Any new modern takes? I mean, just let me know in the comments below. Leave a like, leave a comment. And yeah, tell me what you think. But thanks for watching.